Welcome to History Happy Hour. I am your host, Jess Edberg, Executive Director of the Dorothy Molter Museum. The purpose of this program is to educate, inspire, and entertain with a pint-sized historical tale related to the Ely area history and about the time it takes to drink a glass of your favorite beverage. Let me qualify this program by saying the history I share is not a deep dive. Rather, it scratches the surface using publicly accessible resources, including online content, in-person interviews, and published materials. Additionally, this program is offered as a free in-person half-hour event October through May, typically on the third Wednesday of the month at 5 p.m. at the Boathouse Brewpub and Restaurant in Ely, Minnesota. History Happy Hour is supported in kind by the Boathouse Brewpub, Ely's Heritage Preservation Commission, the Dorothy Molter Museum, Boundary Waters Connect, the Ely Folk School, and Ely Trivia Night. We all know that access to clean, potable water is essential to good public health, a strong economy, and thriving ecosystems, and just sustaining life. We also know that it's necessary to manage our wastewater to ensure healthy drinking water. Humans have been cleverly and creatively devising ways to ensure proper sanitation for millennia. Here in Minnesota, where it's darn near impossible to throw a stone and not hit water, it's not a mystery to how post-glacial humans may have secured water resources. But what about other places around the planet? What about other times in human history? Although I did find a rabbit hole on the geological history of how water formed on planet Earth, I will not be sharing that information here. The Cliff Notes version of how we are on the only habitable planet in our solar system is that Earth's accessible water is variably and eternally dependent on the dynamics of the Earth's interior. Physical scientists theorize that water likely played important roles in the generation of plate tectonics and the formation of the Earth's crust, and eventually the continents. And the action of plate tectonics exposing continental crust to water affects modulation of the atmosphere, which then affects the amount of surface water through degassing and precipitation. It's a whole global water cycle, which circulates surface water into the deep mantle and back to the surface again. So we are jumping ahead a few billion years to save some time. A published study in 2017 focused on how early humans survived in East Africa 1 to 2 million years ago, where periodic droughts left riverbeds and watering holes dry. Researchers focused on the concept of water refuges, coining a new term, hydrorefugia, that included springs, wetlands, groundwater-fed perennial streams, and groundwater-fed rivers. The study concluded, and I paraphrase, that generational knowledge of where and how to find these hydrorefugia during times of drought allowed them to eventually migrate out of Africa and evolve as a species. Of course, this study also sees a global relevance since about 45% of Earth is covered in dry land, and we have a little issue of climate change. But I digress. The moral of the story is that early humans left the Fertile Crescent with generational knowledge of how to identify and locate water sources, even if the water itself was not visible. This knowledge allowed for expansion and further evolution of the human species. As humans established permanent civilizations with growing populations, securing water for drinking, hygiene, and agricultural practices became more complex. Mesopotamians introduced clay sewer pipes around 6,000 years ago, about the same time that ancient Chinese were drilling deep water wells. Domestic wastewater has been used for irrigation and fertilization since the Bronze Age, and ancient Egyptians were using copper plumbing 4,000 years ago. Two of the most well-known advanced civilizations using sophisticated public water systems were the Mayans over 4,000 years ago and the Roman Empire over 2,000 years ago. The Mayans engineered landscape-altering infrastructure in a region of the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico called the PUC, where there are no natural water sources, no streams, no lakes, no springs, no cenotes, nothing. To facilitate existence, they became proficient in collecting and managing rainwater with massive systems of above ground drainage and below ground cisterns called chultons. Chultons were bottle shaped and often lined with plaster to prevent seepage and averaged 7,500 gallons, which was enough to supply 25 people year round. Yucatan Mayans also left evidence behind of developing a sophisticated water filtration system using the minerals zeolite and quartz sand for their drinking water, a system so functional that it would still be used today. The use of zeolite for water purification predates other known examples by 1,800 years, according to the BBC. Of course, wastewater and solid waste had to be dealt with as well. Archaeologically speaking, it appears that as advanced as their drinking water system was, their sewer systems were informal and generally included using gardens and fields as latrines to fertilize cultivated plants. Small circular pits in dwellings and public latrines were also used, and based on the chemical composition of excavated samples, they flushed their toilets with lime water left over from making tamales. But if you really want to see impressive advancements in water and sewer systems, go no further than ancient Roman civilization during the Etruscan dynasty about 600 BCE. Behold the Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's earliest and most extensive sewer systems. Named after the Roman goddess Cloacina, whose name derives from the Latin words cloere, meaning to wash or purify, and cloaca, meaning sewer. This system started as an open-air canal to serve as a storm drain and to help drain local marshes for additional buildable land. Over a few hundred years, the Great Sewer expanded to underground tunnels, had elaborately decorated manholes installed, and connected to all 11 of Rome's aqueducts, which significantly improved the movement of wastes through the system. Fun fact, did you know that the Latin word cloaca influenced its biological use? Fittingly, cloaca is the term for the common chamber in the pelvic region of some vertebrates, such as beaver, where the intestinal and urogenital tracts discharge and facilitate reproduction. Anywho, how did the drinking waters get separated from the non-drinking water flowing through the Cloaca Maxima in Rome? Throughout the Roman Empire, hundreds of aqueducts were built, one of the longest being over 50 miles. Roman aqueducts exclusively relied on gravity to move water over a slight downward gradient and were protected by law and custom. When water reached a town or city, it flowed into enormous cisterns or castella, which were situated on the highest ground. These large reservoirs held the water supply for the city and were connected to a vast network of lead pipes. It was quite the infrastructure. To ensure clean, potable water coming into communities from the aqueducts, Romans built settling basins periodically to slow the flow and allow heavier impurities to settle out. Again, this conjured an image of the mighty beaver and its pond for me. They utilized natural filtration methods using gravel, sand, and charcoal to remove impurities before water flowed into plaster-lined cisterns. Romans also had practical knowledge of the various qualities of their water sources, adding more filtration as needed. All in all, the ancient Romans were quite sophisticated with their water systems 2,000 years ago, except for those lead pipes. Some researchers suggest the Roman Empire's collapse was hastened by lead poisoning. To see this technology in action, visit the Segovia Aqueduct in Spain, which still transports water over 20.3 miles from the Fuente Fria River to Segovia as it has for the last 20 centuries. However, then came the Middle Ages and the fall of the Roman Empire, and apparently the concepts of basic sanitation fell too. These dark ages saw fewer sewer systems that were generally less developed and more rudimentary than those of ancient Rome. One reason may have been the prevailing religious philosophy that uncleanliness was closer to godliness. Large European cities like London and Paris began to stink from the cesspits and cesspools, as well as the practice of just relieving oneself wherever and whenever was convenient. It's no surprise that dysentery, a severe diarrheal disease most well known for its role on the Oregon Trail, became a significant cause of illness and death in the Middle Ages. Sadly, it seemed that almost everyone in Europe had forgotten the lessons learned in sanitation from the Romans, and any Central and South American indigenous peoples with any generational knowledge had no doubt been massacred by hand or by disease by the Spanish in the 15th century. So, needless to say, when they colonized the Americas, they didn't bring their best sanitation game. The good news is we caught up. It took a while and acts of Congress, but here we are. You may already know the city of Ely was incorporated in 1888 as a mining town. Little infrastructure existed, and water was taken directly from Shagwa Lake. The city's sewer system was an open pipe into a ditch. By June of 1889, Ely had an intake system set up near where Seamers Beach is today. Water was pumped to the west end of Chapman Street, where it was stored in a concrete floored reservoir, and then pumped up to the wooden water tower, which was located adjacent to the current City Hall building. According to the Ely Miner, Ely was the first city in Minnesota to implement a water filter for its municipal supply. In 1912, the U.S. Public Health Service Act passed, and the subsequent 1914 drinking water standards focused on preventing the spread of waterborne diseases, particularly typhoid fever, another Oregon Trail favorite, through treatment like chlorination. It's unclear when Ely incorporated chlorination to the water supply, but unsurprisingly, as Ely grew and expanded with both operating mines and residents, the water quality of Shagwa Lake began to decline to the point that public health officers were dispatched to Ely in July of 1916. Testing revealed that the purification treatments were being applied properly and that the drinking water was safe, and made a few recommendations. 2 years later, in 1918, the city of Ely began the process of planning a new sedimentation tank and water piping. It's unclear what improvements were made between 1918 and 1928, but what is clear is that the water quality of Shagwa Lake was continuing to decline. In November of 1928, the Ely Miner reported that the Minnesota Health Department had been in Ely investigating the town's water supply for a week. Apparently, concerns arose due to a moldy taste and smell. Today, we know that although not great, a moldy taste and smell in water is usually harmless and caused by organic matter like algae or decaying plant material. Biofilms, layers of bacterial and other microorganisms that just grow inside of pipes. Side note, Ely still experiences a sometimes off putting water smell. The naturally occurring Cynura algae can cause a seasonal cucumber or fruity odor in drinking water that is generally harmless. However, in 1928, the smelly drinking water was a strong indicator of contaminants. According to residents of town, who used an average of 100 gallons per person per day, the water was foul smelling and foul tasting and became a point of contention with public demand that something be done, with suggestions from the public to locate an alternative water supply at Burnside Lake. By this time, the city of Ely had already implemented a sedimentation basin, filters, and chemical treatment with chlorine and ammonia, but folks really didn't want to have to plug their nose to drink water. The Ely Miner published a lengthy article from the Board of Sanitation that recommended people drink the water as cold as possible to avoid the off putting taste, and bolstered the town system by saying, "It should be needless to state in conclusion, but still it seems necessary, that persons going to springs and poorly constructed wells for drinking water are sacrificing the safety offered by our city water supply to overcome what appears to us at present an imaginary distaste for the public water supply." They went so far as to say the cost was just too high to end up with the same problem on a different lake. To be fair, the scientific knowledge of water quality, water ecology, and public sanitation today are leaps and bounds beyond that of the 1930s. But even then, there were folks who could see that the lake ecology and water quality of Burnside was quite different from that of Shagwa. The first being that there wasn't sewage draining into Burnside Lake. As much as the Board of Sanitation hoped they could deter the public's interest in the issue, by 1931, the city of Ely had a 3-year plan to improve the city's water system and supply. Additionally, there was apparently a cow problem, as in the bovine. Cattle owned by residents left unsightly cow pies in the alleyways, which likely contributed to the high phosphorus levels in Shagwa Lake via the city's sewer system. But cows were needed to meet the state milk supply laws, and guess what? They drank a lot of water. By the early 1930s, Ely's population was over 6,000, and 1 million gallons of water was being used each day. The new water system would not only address how palatable the water was, but be able to meet the consumption needs as Ely continued to grow. At a special city council meeting in January 1931, the council dove headfirst into a plan to build a water line to Burnside Lake. The new water intake, filtration, and pump system was completed by July 1932 and still services Ely today. In 1948, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act provided federal assistance and funding to states for water quality protection, but I was unable to locate any record that Ely benefited from this at the time. By the late 60s, reactive repairs to the water line weren't enough. A full replacement was on the horizon. And in 1969, the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, was passed and established national environmental goals along with statutes, such as requiring an environmental assessment before taking any major actions on the landscape. In January 1970, a tentative plan to replace the 5 miles of water supply line was approved after the superintendent of the Ely Water and Light Department reported to the city council it was required. The project went out for bid, and in July, Lustig and Sons of Ely began replacing the 5-mile line with 14-inch cast iron pipe, and by fall of 1971, it was completed. Since then, pump and filter replacements have occurred, but a full replacement is on the horizon again. Also in 1970, the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, was established as an independent agency of the United States government responsible for protecting human health and the environment by ensuring clean air, land, and water, and administering and enforcing federal environmental laws. Up until this time, the city's water treatment plant was also near where Seamers Beach is and included 2 Imhoff tanks. An Imhoff tank combines sedimentation and anaerobic sludge digestion in a single unit. It's used for treating raw wastewater, separating solids from liquids, and stabilizing the settled sludge through anaerobic digestion, and then the treated water can be released. This settling tank was originally designed by German engineer Karl Imhoff in 1905 and was introduced to the United States in 1911. It quickly gained popularity, with nearly half of all municipal sewage settling tanks in North America being Imhoff tanks by the mid-1930s. Early on, it was used as the only processing system, as the prevailing knowledge about contaminants was that dilution is the solution to the pollution, an idea that originated primarily during the Industrial Revolution on the belief that as long as pollutants such as wastewater and storm runoff were dispersed enough, their harmful effects could be minimized. The Imhoff tanks were abandoned when a biological treatment process called trickling filter was installed at Ely in 1954. As time marched on, Shagwa Lake's levels of phosphorus continued to increase, and the area of the shoreline near the plant and storm drain quickly got a nickname, Stinky Ditch. Youth growing up in Ely in the 1960s and 70s were cautioned not to swim in the lake, especially anywhere near Stinky Ditch, due to the pollution and algae blooms that caused rashes and a bad smell. And soon, the EPA came to town. In 1966, the Shagwa Lake Restoration Project began. The EPA financed construction of a full-scale tertiary treatment system during 1971 to 1972 to process 28,000 gallons per day. Stormwater was diverted from Stinky Ditch to the mine pit, also known as Miners Lake, in 1972. The EPA used this as a new pilot project to demonstrate that by removing very high levels of nutrient phosphorus, the eutrophication or the increase in plant and algae growth due to excessive amounts of nutrients could be reversed. It was a very complex operation referred to as a two-stage lime precipitation with recarbonation facility that could remove 99.9% of the phosphorus from domestic wastewater, which was unheard of anywhere in the world. And as evidenced by the water quality of Shegwa Lake today, it was an incredible success. Residents watched Shegwa Lake improve, and scientists from around the world wanted to learn more. Results from this pilot project were used to establish a new phosphorus standard at every wastewater plant in the US. However, after a few years, the EPA pulled out and left the system and its oversight, along with expenses, to the city of Ely with no forewarning. From then on, the city of Ely and its staff has managed and maintained the system and received many regional and national recognitions over the years for their excellence of service and promotion of a national standard for phosphorus. Terry Jackson, a former city worker, shared that he wrote many grants to help fund the operation and improvements of the facility, including one to the Minnesota Department of Health to construct a new water treatment plant, but it was turned down. That is, until he had the linemen place poles on the building to support the sagging exterior walls. That move propelled Ely to the front of the funding list. That was 40 years ago, and Terry says the old timers still talk about how they saved Ely's water plant. Achieving high standards for water quality means a lot of work, and this includes a biannual pumping of the sludge that accumulates in the tank. This is similar to having your pump your septic. If you don't, it will fill up and muck up the system or backflow into your home. But what happens to all of that sludge, or in technical terms, biosolids? Between the 70s and the 90s, it was landfilled. However, in the 90s, the city began a partnership with local agriculture producers where the biosolids were applied to the land for fertilizer. This lasted until the early 2000s when land ownership demographics changed and the idea of human waste, albeit treated, being applied to land was unpalatable to neighbors. Biosolids then had to be trucked up an hour and a half to be dispersed in ag areas outside of Ely. Until recently, when Harold implemented a new technique that created a 45% cost savings in biosolid waste disposal. Have you ever heard of dehydrated poo? Well, it's not exactly that, but the city now rents a Fergus power pump twice a year that uses a belt press on rollers to squeeze out the water content of the biosolids that then goes back into the treatment plant. The remaining biosolid has what Harold calls a cake batter consistency, and you're welcome for that visual. It's then loaded into City of Ely trucks and delivered to the Virginia landfill. Ideally, the city would like to purchase one of these feces presses, but the price tag of $1 million is a bit steep for the time being. Additionally, the city's municipal water system needs an upgrade, which is a bit more of a priority. Replacing 5 miles of water line may seem like a potentially impractical feat, but consider this. Burnside Lake provides Ely with the best drinking water in the state and potentially the country, according to Harold Langowski, for several reasons. There is limited commercial and residential development around the lakeshore. The rocky geology of the shoreline and lake bed make it less convenient to build and maintain infrastructure. This helps reduce potential for contaminants from runoff and human activity. It's also very deep. Ely's water is drowned from 40 feet deep. And statistically, the city of Ely draws 0.4 inches a year, less than half an inch from the surface water of Burnside Lake. To invest in updating and upgrading the drinking water system for Ely, the city needs to secure $5 million to replace the water line, including the structures that secure it and support it, as well as the equipment in the pump house. And that is not including funding to support replacement of the town's old brass water pipe fittings that used a lead based solder when constructed. Harold had initiated the process to obtain federal funding and was one of 15 projects in Minnesota that had made the cut last fall. The grant from the EPA and a low interest state loan would support the full project. Unfortunately, the funding bill that ended the threat of a government shutdown in March eliminated hundreds of millions of dollars in local earmarks slated for communities around the state. The good news is that the Public Facility Fund can still loan up to $2.5 million with a 1.5% interest rate. It's not as nice as getting grant funding to support the remaining project. It would also mean a detailed review of utility costs that is held every spring. That rate review isn't already in progress to determine next year's budget with cost reductions, efficiencies, and savings identified, and likely rate increases. So, what can you do? Individuals can contribute to improving public sanitation and creating healthier, more sustainable communities in a variety of ways. Least of all is to understand how the drinking water and sanitation system you use in your home functions and what your responsibilities are as a user and community member. Practice proper waste disposal and or composting guidelines. This includes dropping unwanted medications in the receptacle at Ely City Hall. Additionally, find out when the city and county are offering their periodical hazardous waste drop-off days. And never, ever flush menstrual products or so-called flushable wipes. They are not flushable. Same goes for vault or pit toilets, by the way. Be mindful of what you are sending into the storm drain or watershed. Pick up litter. So many little things make a big difference. Attend community meetings. Consider applying to be on the City Utilities Commission. Get to know your township board and county commissioners, or understand how your elected officials address these topics and let your voice be heard. There is a great opportunity coming soon thanks to the Ely Folk School. The Ely Folk School and the Minnesota Humanities Center are hosting a We Are Water Minnesota exhibit from April 24th through June 16th, 2025 at the Ely Area Community Hub on Miners Drive. This traveling exhibit examines water issues statewide and in local communities through personal stories, histories, and scientific information. It strengthens Minnesota's relationship with water, exposes visitors to new perspective, and increases participation in water stewardship activities. Thank you for being here. Thank you to my sources of imagery and information, especially Katie Clark, who you may know her work through the Ely Timber Jay, and Harold Langowski, City Clerk for Ely, who took time to meet with me, as well as Terry Jackson, retired City of Ely worker on Ely's public water systems. If you have any questions about the things covered in this program or would like to follow History Happy Hour, please find us on Facebook or Instagram. History Happy Hour is supported in kind by the Boathouse Brewpub, Ely's Heritage Preservation Commission, the Dorothy Molter Museum, Boundary Waters Connect, the Ely Folk School, and Ely Trivia Night. Thank you for listening to this episode of History Happy Hour. Local history is our shared history, and your engagement with this topic keeps it alive. I especially hope that this program helps those of you who are not directly connected to it understand and appreciate it a little bit more. Please join us next time to be inspired to learn more about our shared history.